Welcome to the Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at North Kentucky University. My guest today is journalist, editor, and publisher Kenneth White, who is also the author of The Uncrowned King, The Sensational Rise of William Randolph Hearst, and most recently, Hoover, An Extraordinary Life in Extraordinary Times. I came across Mr. White's book on Hoover as part of my sort of biographies before bed ritual, which I've talked about in the show in the past. Initially I thought that Herbert Hoover would be an awfully dull subject, honestly, but I quickly learned how wrong I was. In fact, right after I finished it, I recommended the book on a previous show. Listeners, you'll know that. And I also contacted Mr. White's publisher, hoping that I might get a chance to talk with him about this really exceptional book. And he graciously agreed, and here we are. So, Kenneth White, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
My pleasure, Michael.
Now, before we get into Herbert Hoover, I'd like to ask a little bit about you. You've made a move from publishing executive to author. How did that happen?
Well, I did it all pretty much concurrently for a long time. I was running a magazine publishing company in Canada at the time that I wrote the Hearst book, and actually through most of the Hoover book, I continued to work either as a publisher or in the telecom industry. So I had a day job through all of that time. And I've just now, since Hoover came out, dedicated myself to writing almost full time, but I've actually started publishing books on my own, started a new publishing company doing nonfiction books for North American audiences, and so that's my day. Writing's my day job now, and publishing books is my supplementary work.
Well, I think that's a good piece of advice to any aspiring authors. It certainly helps to have a day job, at least at first, given the publishing industry. I get William Randolph Hearst. That makes total sense for me, given your background. But Herbert Hoover, what led you to write a book about Herbert Hoover?
I was a reluctant author of a Herbert Hoover book. I had been, I really enjoyed writing about the late 19th century with Hearst in his New York years. And I thought when I was finished that I would like to move up a couple of generations, do something in the early 20th century. And so I was poking around the First World War. And you can't read too much in the First World War without coming across Hoover. He was seen at the time, he was based in London, where he was a mining executive, as this extraordinarily competent fellow. And if you wanted to get anything done, you went and saw Herbert. And this didn't matter if you were in business, in politics, or in other aspects of public life. Hoover was all over the place and had this profile of being incredibly capable and in a way that is totally at odds with everything else I'd read about. Anyway, during the Great War, Hoover almost single-handedly fed the nation of Belgium, which was caught behind German lines and had its food supply, almost all of its food was imported, and its food supply was cut off by the British blockade. So there was 8 million people in Belgium in danger of starving. And Hoover, based in London, started the Commission for Relief of Belgium and almost single-handedly fed 8 million Belgians through the course of the First World War. It was an act of humanitarianism, pretty much unlike anything in recorded history, let alone American history. And I was fascinated by that, Hoover's Belgian adventure, and the fact that he had pretty much saved Belgium. It was Schindler's List on a colossal scale, and I wanted to write about that. But every publisher I took it to said, no, this Hoover guy, he sounds interesting. You got to do the whole biography. I'm not a big fan of presidential biographies. They always strike me as they as a genre. There's a lot of special pleading. This guy's a hero of republicanism, and this guy's a hero of the Democratic Party. This is the guy who should be an example to the left or to the right. It's all very present-minded, and everybody gets into the ranking of the presidents and so on. That maybe it's because I'm a Canadian, doesn't interest me so much. So I resisted the call to do a biography. But the more I looked at Hoover, the more there was to the whole of his life. The fact that he was, born in this little Quaker village on the American frontier, orphaned at the age of 9, sent around from one branch of his family to another, had a very difficult adolescence, felt he was treated as a chore boy by his relatives, quite a sad boyhood on the whole. Finally makes his way to Stanford University in its very first year. He was actually the very first student in the history of Stanford University. In his early 20s, he goes to Australia and begins to make a fortune in the gold mines there. He's running some of the richest gold mines in Australia in his early 20s. In his mid 20s, he's running the largest coal mine in China on behalf of the Chinese government and exploring for other mines in China. He gets caught up in the Boxer Rebellion, goes back to London, makes a fortune as a mining tycoon, and then as I said earlier, in the First World War, he switches gears entirely and becomes a humanitarian. Then he goes into public life, and first with Woodrow Wilson. He was in Wilson's war cabinet. Then he serves Harding and Coolidge as the Commerce Secretary. Then he has his own presidency. Spends the New Deal years hating Roosevelt and hiding in the wilderness. Finally, reemerges after the Second World War, when he's put to work again by Harry Truman and subsequently Eisenhower. He served 5 presidents. He could have served a 6th. John F. Kennedy was a huge Hoover fan, but by that time Hoover was in his 80s and wanted to dedicate his time to fishing. So, it was just this remarkable life, and you could tell pretty much the whole story of the early 20th century through Hoover, and that really captured my imagination, and it was a chance to write about a guy who is hugely misunderstood, who had a far more interesting life than people appreciate. And also, when you follow that life, you get a whole other angle on the 20th century than you typically get reading about the Wilsons and the Roosevelts and so on. Hoover had a different perspective and was involved in a greater range of activities and different causes than those other gentlemen. And as a result, you get as I say, a very different window on the 20th century.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I guess the thing that surprised me the most was his pre-presidential career. I mean, it was almost kind of like a swashbuckling sort of thing. All sorts of interesting deals and arrangements and things. And I got the sense that certainly some of the things that he did were maybe not entirely above board. Would that be a fair characterization?
Yeah, that might even be too fair. Some are definitely below board. There was the most notorious incident was in China when he was working for the Chinese government on its coal mines, but at the same time, he had an arrangement with some capitalists back in London, and on their behalf, on behalf of the London firm, he took advantage of the dislocation and confusion during the Boxer Rebellion to more or less extort the largest coal mining operation in China from its rightful owners, and he ended up in court in London for that, and was treated quite harshly by the judge in the trial, and his firm had to essentially give the mine back to the Chinese. And there were reports that came out at trial of Hoover threatening his Chinese counterparts with violence, and even waving a gun around at one point in order to get his deal done. So that's even for the time, it was egregious behavior on behalf of a businessman, and was understood as such. So yes, he has quite a bit to answer for in his business career. The guy was absolutely determined to make a success of himself. He felt that he'd been, mistreated, abused in his early years, and he was going to make his way in the world and show everybody whatever it took. And as a result, his behavior was, even by his own standards, wanting.
And it seemed to me, well, one thing that really struck me was what an incredibly hard worker he is. And he also seemed to be quite a hard taskmaster. Yet throughout his career, there seemed to be a group of people around him who were just almost maybe fanatically devoted, but very extremely devoted to him, despite that, how hard he worked and worked them.
Yeah, it's funny with Hoover, you always expect when somebody accomplishes so much in life that you'll find the seeds of greatness in his early life, but almost nobody expected anything of Hoover until he was, until he was graduated from university. And there was even some people who thought that he was slow. Other people thought he was socially inept, and would never find his way. But the moment he gets out into the working world, he is something of a wonder. He has enormous energy. He has an incredibly quick and retentive mind, and a great strategic sense in everything he does, an ability not only to command all of the minutiae, all of the details of all of the projects he's working on, but always to keep in mind at the same time the grand strategy behind everything he was doing. And he did work relentlessly. He drove himself incredibly hard, broke down twice during his business career because of his exhaustion and tension over the troubles that he was getting himself in. And as soon as he started in business and started to accomplish things, people took notice, and they all realized after having some contact with him that this was a really unusual guy, and he was going to do things and do places. So you start to get, when he's in his 20s, people jotting down notes, writing memos about Hoover, recording their impressions of him, which was really valuable to me because Hoover never was much of a letter writer, never had a diary or anything. So getting close to him as a biographer was a difficult thing except for the fact that so many people seem to recognize some species of greatness in him that they all took the time to write down their experiences, their conversations with him, and to record for posterity that they had some contact with this remarkable individual.
And I really think of all the incredible things he did prior to his presidency, and you've talked about this before, the Belgian relief effort, which, I mean, for listeners, it's totally worth, just for the story of that, to read Hoover, not amongst all the other stuff. But it almost, after reading that, I thought, my God, why didn't this man win the Nobel Peace Prize? Because it seemed to me this was a colossal, just incredibly audacious, almost impossible seeming sort of thing that he did, and truly, truly astonishing.
Yeah, and really he should have won for it. There has never been anything like this, and it was uh, not just Belgium that Hoover pulled off. After the First World War, uh, he went. He had, in the last years of the war, when America entered the war, he had come back to work with Wilson, helping to manage America's food supply during the war. And then when Wilson went to Paris for the Treaty of Versailles negotiations, Hoover went with him. And as Wilson did all of his negotiating with the other great powers, Hoover was assigned basically to reconstruct war-torn Europe after the Great War. The war had stopped on a dime, and the whole of the continent had to get back to civilian life, but so much of the economy had been on a war footing. All of the factories were on a war footing. The railroads and highways had all been commandeered for the purposes of making war. All of the food supplies that had been centrally handled in service of military efforts. And so Hoover had to oversee, in a very short period of time, a kind of an emergency reconstruction of the European economy back to a civilian footing, and made sure that populations that otherwise would have starved, especially in the defeated countries of Germany and Austria, made sure that people got food that had to be shipped in from outside their borders. And he saved many millions of more lives there. And then in the Russian famine in 21, 22, he did the same thing. He's credited over the course of his life with saving upwards of 100 million lives through his humanitarian efforts. And that's just mind-boggling. I can't think of anyone else who has done anything like that, and especially not in the devastating circumstances that he was operating in. It wasn't like he was doing it on a sunny day in peacetime when everyone was happy and feeling rich. He was doing it when the whole world was at war, and he was, the logistical facts of feeding Belgium are just staggering, because at the time, as I said, all of the ships, all of the food, all of the money has been commandeered to the war efforts. Yet Hoover manages to get um, fleets of ships going around the world to 5 continents, picking up food by the hundreds of tons, and getting it all back to London, then to Belgium. And to do that, you have to go through the British blockade and through the German lines, and you have to get permissions of both governments. And those governments are at war. And here's Hoover with his Commission for Relief of Belgium, flying his own flag and using his own passports. Somebody called him a piratical nation, pirate nation, for benevolence. and he's sailing all this food to Belgium at a time when nobody else could get anything at all done. So it was an incredible feat.
Yeah. Another thing that struck me was the reputation that he had on really from both parties for just such exceptional competence, and how it seemed like both under Wilson, Harding, Coolidge, he would come into a situation and take a job and make it as big as possible, expand into so much. And presidents, again, of both parties actually leaned on him to an extent that just seemed remarkable to me.
Yeah, he really was viewed as the most competent man in America at the time, and rightfully so. There was some exaggeration in some of the things he did, but there's no doubt that he was the most important figure in the Harding cabinet for Harding's three years, and then again he played an enormous role in Coolidge's cabinet, and he was in charge of all of not only a lot of important files, but all of the really modern files, anything new that was happening in the world at that time. He was deeply involved in. For instance, automobiles were pretty new, and there was very little in the way of traffic safety at the time. Most towns didn't even have stoplights, and roads were unmarked and so on. And the death rate on the roads with all of these fast cars out there with in a kind of a lawless highway system, the death rate was incredible. So Hoover organized really the first important traffic safety council, and made or started the great chore of making highways relatively safe for people. When the airline industry starts to come in the 20s, before it could be a civilian passenger airline, they had to do some work on safety, because pilots, at the time, most of the pilots were well, the government hired a lot of a lot of pilots to start delivering mail, and again the death toll among them was quite high. So Hoover essentially organized the nation's aviation industries, and laid the groundwork for a commercial aviation industry in the U.S. He was the first man to appear on television, and he essentially organized both radio and broadcast regulation in a way that we would still recognize today back in the 20s. So all of these very modern problems, Hoover was the guy that these governments turned to, because nobody else had the energy, the capacity, the know-how to get it done.
And that's what maybe more than anything else amazes me, or what I guess I didn't realize about Herbert Hoover. I mean, here's this man who is incredibly competent and has a track record not only of getting big things done, but of being okay with using government to get things done. But in the popular imagination, he's this kind of unimaginative, conservative guy who hated government and was just completely overwhelmed by the Great Depression.
Yeah, that is one of the fascinating things about Hoover. When he came to Washington in the last years of the Great War, he was viewed as a progressive, and he was a progressive. He did believe in using government to improve the quality of life of the American people, and he had watched Lloyd George and some of the liberals in England and been impressed by their social welfare programs. And he brought some of that thinking back to the US. So journalists like Walter Lippmann thought Hoover was, and Lippmann was at the time uh, a leading intellectual in progressive circles, thought Hoover was one of the most interesting men he'd ever met. And they all viewed him, all of the intellectual progressives at the time, as a man of great promise for progressivism in America. They hoped that he would run for president and bring his new attitudes about using government um, uh, for the public good to Washington. And he remained, even when he decided to run as a Republican rather than a Democrat. It was never really clear what party he belonged to. He was nevertheless always on the progressive wing of the Republican Party all through the 20s, and often at odds with Calvin Coolidge, who was extremely Coolidge is the embodiment of the skinflint caricature of Hoover that many of us had in the past. Coolidge didn't believe in using government for anything. Wanted people to if people could go through their lives and not on a daily basis have any sort of reminder that the federal government existed, that was with Coolidge. Hoover vehemently disagreed with that approach and thought that Coolidge was continually missing opportunities to help the American economy grow, to raise the quality of life for children, for the less fortunate, by not using the powers of the state.
In a lot of ways, Teddy Roosevelt's my favorite president. In a lot of ways, Hoover seemed to me to be kind of like a less flashy TR in many instances, at least.
Yeah, and he'd met Theodore Roosevelt. I think Roosevelt was the first president that Hoover ever met, and I think Roosevelt was the reason that Hoover, at the end of the day, decided to become a Republican. And if you read Hoover's inaugural address from 1929, there are many, many echoes of Theodore Roosevelt in it. So I would agree. I think that while he worked for 3 out of the 4 of TR's successors, he and only met TR on one occasion, as far as I know. He owes more to TR than any of the others.
Right. What about that general or common belief or conception that Herbert Hoover was basically overwhelmed by the Great Depression? Is there much truth in that?
Oh, there's some truth in it, because it was an overwhelming event. It was one of the things, Michael, that I was astonished by so many things that happened during those years. That my understanding of what went on turned out to be in error in many ways, and one of them was I tended to think of the Great Depression as something that started in 1929. The economy fell off a cliff when the stock market crashed, and it was this long, devastating depression, lasted a decade, and was one great coherent event. But when you get in there with Hoover and watch what happens on a day-to-day basis, it's something else entirely. The stock market crashed in 29, but really nobody at the time thought that that was a very big deal. And all of the economists thought that if there would be a recession after the stock market crash of 29, it would be very brief and not too harsh. And Hoover believed that too. They all thought that the economy of the U.S., having roared through the 20s, was fundamentally sound. That there was, a lot of hype in the stock market, and that bubble had to be broken. But once it was, things would proceed much as they had before. And so Hoover's response to the market crash in 29 was to tell people that the fundamentals of the economy were strong and that they had nothing to fear but fear itself. And he encouraged them to keep spending, to keep working, and to simply wait for this brief storm to pass, and to have confidence that America was the world's leading economy and would continue to be the world's leading economy. And it was a great engine of growth, and it had just stalled temporarily, but it would come roaring back to life in a short period of time. And he was roundly applauded by the New York Times, the business papers at the time, the Harvard Economic Society, for his quick and buoyant response to the market crash. He'd also done some things that had never been done before. For instance, he engaged in some countercyclical spending, big public works program in order to boost employment through what he anticipated would be the brief recession. And he encouraged other levels of government to do the same. And he had encouraged an interest rate cut, and he increased government spending somewhat in order to prime the pump. So, Hoover was again on the ball, on top of the file. Took a progressive and at the time an unprecedented approach to combating the recession. But instead of being short and sharp, it got, or short and shallow, it got worse, and it continued to get worse all through his term. And it went through about 4 or 5 different stages in the course of his presidency. All of those stages different. The first part being the stock market crash, and then there was unemployment became a real issue in the U.S., and then Germany crashed in 1931, and the international dimensions of the problem became really evident. It was one crisis after another for all of the 4 years he was in office, and there wasn't one response there wasn't one Great Depression to fight. He was putting out fires all over the place, and all of the fires had to be fought differently. And he worked incredibly hard at all of these problems, had some success where nobody anticipated he would have success, particularly in the international dimensions of the problems, dealing with European indebtedness and other consequences of the war. And he did make available to the states public aid, which was something that the federal government had never done before in a recession. So he was far more active and far more effective than the history books tell us. On the whole, however, he couldn't dig the U.S. out of the Depression during his term. I don't think anybody could have. I don't think anyone would have tried as hard as Hoover did. But the fact is, it happened on his watch, and politics being what politics are, he had to.
Well, and certainly one could argue that even FDR didn't dig the United States out of the Great Depression, but it was rather World War II. Another argument. But I should also point out, right, that during this period, he was not working with the sort of modern economic statistics that we have today. But in fact, throughout his career, he pushed to create those sort of and gather those sort of statistics. I mean, that was a big part of what he pushed for at his time at the Commerce Department.
Yeah, he was an empiricist. He believed you couldn't have enough data, enough information on any problem. And so he was one of the great statistics gatherers in the history of American government. And he was as important as any one individual in bringing economists into uh, the daily operations of Washington. He believed that not only economists but sociologists and other experts had a lot to add to problem solving in public life, and that it shouldn't all be left to the politicians. In fact, as far as Hoover was concerned, it was better to bypass the politicians, the guys in Congress, and use experts. He was always having conferences of experts in Washington. Whatever the problem arose, his answer was always, "Let's get the experts in." So he did a lot to build databases and new think tanks and other sources of knowledge and expertise. But when it came to the Depression, it was a new phenomenon. It was a phenomenon on a scale that nobody had encountered before. And the economists that he had done so much to bring to Washington were really no help to him whatsoever. One of the more amusing things in the book, at least from the point of view of a biographer, I was amused by it, was there was a conference of economists, including several Nobel Prize winners or future Nobel Prize winners, in Geneva, I think, in the third year of the Depression. And they deliberated for several days on the Depression and couldn't agree on anything, what caused it, where it was really located. They had a list of causes that ran something like 16 pages, and they literally couldn't even agree when to break for lunch. They were useless to anyone who was looking to them for guidance in how to combat the Depression. The things that we now know were hugely important, especially in monetary policy. They hardly discussed at all. So while we fault Hoover for not being able to dig America out of the recession, it's not like anyone was standing on the sidelines with the answers or with a plan of attack that he somehow ignored. He was, to an alarming extent, on his own through almost all that time.
And then it seems to me there's this break point. So there's the Hoover we've been talking about, and up to maybe 1933, I guess you say, Roosevelt comes into office, and in the book, I detect this pretty significant change. He almost seems to morph from a kind of a Roosevelt progressive Republican into sort of a Republican reactionary. I guess I want to know, is that about right? And if so, what do you think was behind that big change in Hoover?
Well, if you look at the facts of Hoover's presidency, he was certainly far more progressive than either of his um, Republican predecessors, Coolidge and was arguably the most progressive president America had had till that time. Um, but he runs up against Franklin Roosevelt in 32, and Roosevelt comes into office after defeating Hoover and takes everything that Hoover does further. Uh, People around Roosevelt would later admit that Hoover laid almost all of the groundwork for what Roosevelt did with the New Deal. But Roosevelt went much further than Hoover would ever have gone. For instance, on job creation programs. Hoover believed in public works and put a lot more people on the public payroll, but Roosevelt just went an order of magnitude further than Hoover, and Roosevelt intervened in the economy, setting prices, setting wages in ways that Hoover wouldn't dreamed of doing, even though Hoover had already intervened in the economy in ways that any of his
Right.
predecessors would have blanched at. So, as far as Hoover was concerned, he'd gone about as far as he thought America could go and still be true to its constitution and its sense of itself as a nation of free individuals with free markets and an open society. And he thought that what Roosevelt was doing threatened that conception of America. Plus, he had a deep mistrust of Roosevelt on a personal level, even a hatred of him for the things that Roosevelt had said about him and about his record during the campaign. And let's be honest, some of the things that Roosevelt said about Hoover during the campaign were completely out of line and frankly ridiculous. He would go on about how Hoover was in league with the five men who controlled the purse strings of the American economy, and demagoguery like that. And he blamed Hoover for having started the Depression, not for having failed to combat it, but for actually
Right.
started it and being the cause of it, which was again a fantastic notion. And he demonized Hoover and made Hoover into a laughing stock in America, and that was something Hoover could never forgive him for. So Hoover sensed that Roosevelt had pushed too far with the New Deal, which, by the way, was shared by other Republicans, by almost the whole of the business community, and a lot of Democrats. Was one of the things that moved Hoover to the right, and the other was, I think, just his personal animosity towards Roosevelt, and he believed Roosevelt had fouled the nest of progressivism, and so that had forced Hoover to embrace his conservatism.
And then after the war, Hoover kind of reemerges, I guess, in a way. And he was ex-president for quite a long time, from 1933 until he died in 64. So what was his post-World War II ex-presidency like?
Well,
just to finish up on your previous
Oh,
question,
sure.
and also to begin to answer this one. Uh, this is to me another um, astonishing thing about Hoover. All of the people around Roosevelt, or the people closest to him, during the um, New Deal years, people like Rex Tugwell and Raymond Morley, said that Hoover laid the groundwork for the New Deal. So Hoover was an instrumental force uh, in the New Deal consensus that dominated the Democratic Party from Roosevelt right through uh, to the Lyndon Johnson years. And so that's one huge ideological stream in American life. After Hoover is out of office and after he has decided he is an enemy of the New Deal, Hoover begins making speeches in which he articulates a conservative response to the New Deal, saying that we can't trust government to do everything for us. We need to rely on the private sector and on individual initiative to grow and expand the economy and improve American quality of life. And he articulated a critique of the New Deal and a principled approach to conservatism that would inspire American conservatives through the 40s and the Eisenhower years and all the way through to Ronald Reagan. He deserves to be considered not only a father of the New Deal, but a father of the conservatism, the modern American conservatism that grew up in response to and as a critique of the New Deal. So Hoover essentially giving birth to both of the major ideological currents in America in the 20th century.
Wow, and that's just truly astonishing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, and of course, that legacy also includes. I mean, that's a living legacy, I would argue, given that well, right at his alma mater, Stanford, there's still the Hoover Institution, which is sort of carrying on in that tradition of President Hoover.
Yes, and Stanford was one of the institutions that meant something to Hoover through the whole of his life, and he never lost contact with it, and was had a home on the campus through most of his lifetime, and was a great donor to Stanford as well. He was heavily involved in his post-political years with boys and girls clubs across America. He was involved in pretty much every major political issue that came up in his lifetime. He after he fought the New Deal, he opposed American entry into the Second World War, as did a surprising number of people at that time. And we kind of lost the fact that there was an almost overwhelming consensus against American entry to the war in the late 30s, early 40s, and Hoover was a leading voice, a very influential one in that. He went to work for Truman, as I'd mentioned, in 1945, 46. He was sent overseas to help build or rebuild the European economy after the Second World War, essentially the same story done after the First World War. And then because the federal government had expanded so dramatically during the Second World War and had sprouted through the New Deal and the war years so many new agencies and departments and such a sprawling bureaucracy. Both Truman and President Eisenhower um, felt that the whole administrative branch needed to be reorganized, and both of them turned to Hoover to modernize the office of the president and the entire executive branch. And he oversaw that, essentially laid the groundwork for the modern American presidency. So he kept extremely busy all those years. And he was writing as well through this time. Some of the writing is not terribly readable, particularly his long defenses of his performance during the Great Depression. But he also wrote memoirs of his humanitarian years. He wrote an incredible book about Woodrow Wilson's adventures in Versailles, and it's that is probably not only the only book written by one president about another president, but it's one of the best books ever written by a president. It's a terrific insight into what happened in those critical months in Paris. All in all, Hoover wrote some 30 books. He often wrote 4 or 5 at a time, up in his apartment in the Waldorf Towers in New York. So the work ethic he had shown as a young man never left him. And he was lucky in his health as well. He kept was able to continue to be vital right up into his late 80s.
Well, he invented that game in the White House, Hoover Ball, wasn't it? That kept him in shape for a while there. I come away from reading the book feeling like Herbert Hoover is quite possibly one of the most important, underappreciated, and underrated people of the entire 20th century, really.
Well, I'm glad you got that. That's what I had thought too. By the time I'd spent some time with him, and it was utterly unexpected. I didn't have that sense of him when I went into this project, but I don't see how you can come to any other conclusion when you see the scope of his life, what he accomplished, what he was involved in, and how influential he was. And, at the time he died in the 60s, it was recognized that he was a great figure of the century and one of the most important Americans of the century. The Kennedys, both Bobby and Jack, recognized Hoover as an extraordinary individual and one of America's all-time great public servants. And interestingly, in the obituaries that were written when Hoover died, there were some who claimed him for the left, right, and said that he was one of the greatest progressives who ever lived. Walter Lippmann wrote one to that effect, and William F. Buckley claimed him for the conservatives and said that he was, an important figure in the growth of American conservatism and deserves to be celebrated as such. And almost all of the obituaries in the Washington Post, New York Times, and so on agreed that he had been unfairly maligned for his handling of the Depression, that there really wasn't anyone who could have done any better than he had done in office, that he'd fought it manfully and imaginatively, but come up short. They recognized that he was not the greatest sort of retail politician, wasn't a great salesman of his own initiatives. That was, I think, his greatest flaw as a politician. Couldn't always bring across what he was thinking and what he was doing, and inspire people the way other politicians, particularly Roosevelt, can or could. But it was recognized at the time of his death that he had done some pretty amazing things, but we've lost that. It's not reflected in the historical record, and that's one of the reasons that I was pleased to write the book, to hopefully begin what I'm sure will be a long, slow process.
Right.
Reintroducing him to the record and getting him his due.
Well, I certainly found it fascinating, and it totally changed my view of Herbert Hoover. So I definitely would encourage listeners to check it out. But before I let you go, what are you working on now?
Well, we've moved up another half century. I'm working in the second half of the 20th century, and I'm particularly interested in the 60s. And it was a very tumultuous decade, as we all know. But when we think of the 60s, we tend to think of the civil rights revolutions, the sexual revolution, the war in Vietnam, and so on. What I'm particularly interested in is what happened to American business in the 60s, because it was really the last great burst of productivity and dynamism in the American economy, and we've never really since then managed to see the same pace of growth and innovation that we had back then. So I'm spending a lot of time on the automobile industry, which was by far the largest piece of the American economy, and what happened to business and the auto industry, in particularly in the 60s. So I'm also spending time as a result with an interesting cast of characters, including Ralph Nader and again Bobby Kennedy and Daniel Patrick Moynihan, all of whom were involved in one way or another at the time. So that's about all I can say about it now. But
Well, that sounds great. I'm looking forward to it. Well, with that, we will close. Kenneth White, thanks very much. I really enjoyed talking with you today.
It was a delight, Michael. Thanks very much, and good luck with the podcast.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Support from listeners just like you is what keeps the show going, and we truly do appreciate it. If you're interested in joining our great group of Politics Guys supporters, you can go to politicsguys.com and click on the Patreon or PayPal links you'll see there. And if you want to support the show without spending anything, you can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Pocket Cast, Stitcher, or whatever other podcast app you use. Share this episode with your friends and followers, and pass along our new show posts and tweets on Facebook and Twitter. Leaving reviews and ratings on iTunes also helps. If you've got a question, comment, correction, or just a random thought you want to share with us, you can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. Our Facebook page, where you can message us and where we post things throughout the week, is facebook.com/politicsguyspage. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Saturday. We hope you'll join us.